right, so David's Island and Fort Slocum. Welcome to Fort Slocum. This picture is at the New Rochelle side of the island. It's the ferry dock that still exists today without the signs. This is where the Klondike and the Shamrock are docked today, but this was for nearly 100 years the site of the ferry service out to the island. It is a fascinating story that we will get to. So this is an 1860 map of New Rochelle, and here is David's Island in the pink. You see Davenport Park is much bigger than it is today. This has all been filled in. This area right here today is where apartment houses. This is about where Trinity School is. Here's Echo Bay. And you see David's Island plus a whole bunch of other islands in here that have not been developed. And as I said, for over 100 years, this served as an active military base. Here's a picture of the island in 1926, totally built up. Here's Davenport Neck here, what would be the way into the New Rochelle Harbor and the New Rochelle Lower Harbor, and the islands that were filled in from Glen Island, and this is Goose Island here. At the height of its service, Fort Slocum was a self-contained community. But before we go there, we want to talk about the indigenous people who inhabited the area. These were the Siwanoy Indians who encamped all along the Sound shores and on the island. In fact, there's been extensive archaeological studies on the island, archaeological digs, and they found extraordinary evidence of the Native American encampments on the island. And you'll learn soon that this played a very important and contemporary development on the island. But here's our only one image of the Siwanoys who inhabited these parts until the white settlers took over in the 1680s, and those would be the Huguenots, followed by the Quakers and others. The earliest history parallels that of the mainland. The Siwanoy Indians sold their land, or what they had a transaction of giving their land for goods to Englishman Thomas Pell. Pell purchased 9,000 acres that now are now considered New Rochelle, the Pelhams, and City Island. It became one of the freehold manors in what's now Westchester County. There were 6 of them: Van Cortlandt Manor, Phillips Manor, and others, and Pell's was the one in the most southern section. Lord Pell willed his property to his nephew, John Pell, and soon after, he sold the northern section of his land to a group of French Huguenots known as, there were the French Huguenots, French refugees, Protestants, known as Huguenots. They were guided by this person, immortalized in a statue that still stands at the intersection of North Avenue, Seacart, and Broadview. This was Jacob Leisler. The Huguenots bought the 6,000 acres from John Pell and his wife Rachel. The deed was signed in 1689, and it included many offshore islands. For the next 175 years, the names of each reflected ownership by various Huguenots and their descendants, including LeCount, Lispenard, Rodman, Meyer, Hewlett, Davenport. They would buy the land that was on shore and all the islands that went along with it. The Huguenots used what's now David's Island for cattle grazing, which is a very odd image, as they would have to swim the cattle or somehow barge the cattle over to the island. Now, by the late 1700s, early 1800s, steamboats had started bringing thousands of vacationers to New Rochelle shores. Ferries between Fulton Slip and Manhattan would also bring people to this vacation area. New Rochelle was slowly moving from being an agrarian society to a resort town. Those of you who heard Wish You Were Here, the waterfront presentation a few weeks ago, remember that I pointed out this beautiful resort known as the Neptune Hotel. And I always comment that the advertisement said, in point of salubrity, it is unsurpassed by any. You can see the steamboat coming in here. And today, this is about the location of the dock. And today you can still see the piers where the steamboats would tie up to let the vacationers out to the clean, fresh air. They were out of the city. They had beautiful panoramic views. And thousands were entertained here. And soon, many, many more would be entertained on John Starren's Glen Island Resort. The steamboat transportation magnate would have his many steamboats bring people from Manhattan to the world's pleasure grounds that he created. This pre-Disney Wonder World was made up of several islands connected by footbridges and chain ferries, and up to 500,000 people came the second year it was open, and its popularity just rose from there. But that's a whole nother story, as you know, and once it's up online, you can see that presentation. I could do a presentation just on Glen Island. It was just such an amazing, amazing place. Now, just off the shore of Glen Island would be another small island that was also used as a steamboat destination. This is where a couple had had Douglas and Sherwood picnic area. This would be just south of Hudson's Grove, which is now Hudson Park today. Here you see 800 young women from a hoop skirt factory enjoying a day's outing on David's Island. Thaddeus Davids had purchased the island in 1856 for about $8,000. He was in the ink manufacturing business. Here you see one of his advertisements that's at the Library of Congress. And he purchased the island intending to build another ink manufacturing plant on it. That plant never materialized, but apparently he had two small, maybe a sealing wax concern or another at the edge of his property, pictured here in this sort of Currier and Ives illustration. This was his home called Echo Manor, and it was located where Sutton Manor is today, overlooking Echo Bay. And just below the bay was where his sealing wax factory was. He wanted his ink manufacturing to go in a former mill, but there was a fire, and he just abandoned all ideas of a New Rochelle-based ink manufacturing plant. So when Simeon Leland, a wealthy hotel magnate, this is the only picture I could find of him here in this illustration, came to him looking to rent the island because he wanted to put a hotel on it. Simeon Leland rented his David's Island to Simeon Leland. Leland had built his cottage, summer cottage, this grand castle view, it was called, with beautiful views of Long Island Sound. Here's a contemporary picture of the building. It's known as Leland Castle today, and it's on the campus of the former College of New Rochelle, sadly. But this was Simeon Leland's home, where he entertained all kinds of dignitaries. He had the Metropolitan Hotel in Manhattan, others in various parts, and this was his home. So he had a view of David's Island and thought it was a great idea, but then the Civil War broke out, and he ended up renting the island to the United States government for the sum of $1,000 a year, with an option to buy it for $25,000 during the lease period. 13 days after the deal was struck, he doubled the rent for the United States government. And here was his island, and the Simeon Leland's castle was right about here. So you can see what a kind of view right about here, the view he would have had. That same day, the US government established a camp hospital on David's Island. Scores of wooden structures housed thousands wounded in the Civil War, both Union soldiers and, after the Battle of Gettysburg, Confederate prisoners of war. They were shipped up here, and there were sentry guard all around the island to shoot any of the Confederate soldiers who tried to escape. We have a really fascinating record of a British nurse from the British Army who was sent to the island to care for the prisoners. And he had an extensive diary that his grandson sent me that gave the accounts of the atrocities they had to deal with on this island. This picture, I just have to tell you, is not of DeCamp Hospital, the Civil War hospital on David's Island. It's actually a picture of my husband's great grandmother, who was a nurse in the Civil War, and his great grandfather was a surgeon, but it does the trick. And here's a wood cut of DeCamp Hospital. You can see it was quite extensive. We also have records from Father McLaughlin, who was the priest at Blessed Sacrament, who used to roll over to tend to the wounded, as did Eliza Moulton, who was part of the Presbyterian Church, who would bring her Bible and goodies for the wounded there. Over the 3 years of the Civil War, 5,000 men were cared for at DeCamp Hospital. It closed shortly after General Lee's surrender in 1865. Then Simeon Leland exercised his option to buy the island. He purchased it for the $25,000, then 2 months later sold it to the government for $36,500. New York State legislators ceded control of the island to the United States government for military purposes the next year. Barracks were constructed and plans laid out for many other buildings. A coast defense post to protect New York Harbor was established in 1870. This illustration that appeared in Harper's Magazine was done by New Rochelle artist Edward Kemble, and included the 3 Rodman cannons. This is part of the coast defense post. Before the turn of the century, deep pits and tunnels were cut into the lodge rook, and a battery of 16 mortar cannons were installed on the south end of the island, all to be directed into the shipping lane. So sentrymen were placed all around the higher upper ridge of the island looking for enemy ships that were going to go supposedly up Long Island Sound into the East River and down to attack Manhattan. A direct artillery was placed on the north end. Now, as an artillery post, the island's chief function was to defend against these ships. Here's a map, and on it, it says David's Island, New York Harbor. They actually considered this part of Long Island Sound New York Harbor, and it was a key part of many defense installations along the Sound and the East River. This illustration also appeared in Harper's Weekly, but in 1898, with the caption, "A First Lesson in the Art of War, Recruits for the 2 additional artillery regiments at Fort Slocum, David's Island." This illustration was rendered by New Rochelle resident artist Frederick Remington. Note the building in the back. The island was officially named Fort Slocum on July 1st, 1896 by Director of President Grover Cleveland. And I've always wondered if he came to actually do the naming. I couldn't find anything in the newspapers because he was involved with a presidential scandal involving New Rochelle, and would have been very interesting if he had spent time here. But again, that's another story, another presentation. Back to Fort Slocum, the naming was in honor of Major General Henry Warner Slocum, who was a Civil War hero who had died just 2 years prior at the age of 66. He was quite a heroic general in the Civil War. And there is a statue of him in Grand Army Plaza in Brooklyn. The base continued to grow. Here are some additional barracks that were built in 1886. The mess hall was constructed in 1886 as well. Recruit barracks, these are one of several, were built in 1888. And this is the building that you saw in the illustration that was done by Frederick Remington. And the troops started coming in temporary housing as the barracks were built and then were moved into the barracks. This is Group 21st Company. I have to tell you, in the library, we have hundreds of pictures now available online of Fort Slocum. It was really very well documented from the time it was part of the defense to its later years after World War II. And here you can see a panorama from 1889 to see all the construction that was taking place. Here's the parade ground that would stay for many, many years. And the buildings would go up around it, the important buildings, the barracks over here, the artillery down here. David's Island Military Reservation, New York Harbor, view of parade. Another picture of the general mess. And in 1909, on November 14th, the Chapel of St. Sebastian, Soldier and Martyr, was dedicated on Fort Slocum. This has a really interesting local connection, as it was Father Tom McLaughlin, the rector of Blessed Sacrament, who raised the funds necessary, wrote to President Teddy Roosevelt to request this. It would be the only privately built chapel on a military base. He had one of his congregants, Peter Dorn, and Valentine Dorn, his father, design it and built it and raised all the funds necessary. Peter Dorn also designed the first structure that served as Blessed Sacrament before the current one was constructed, and that would become the Blessed Sacrament School. If you look below at the chapel, you can see the similarity. Apparently the same blueprint was used for the post chapel as was the first Blessed Sacrament. That same year, Olivia Slocum Sage, who was a niece of General Warner Slocum, donated funds to build a YMCA on the island. And it was a magnificent building. Here's a front view of it, and it would serve the island well. When America declared war in 1917, Fort Slocum would become the busiest recruiting depot east of the Mississippi. In the 2-year period of World War I, over 140,000 recruits were processed on the island. The fort was housing up to 4,000 men a day, far than any more other time. These young men were coming from all over the Northeast, Maine, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, and they would come into New Rochelle via the train, take a trolley down to the dock, take a ferry over, and here they would go through the recruitment process before they were shipped out to get on their ships that would take them over to serve in World War I overseas. So some images of the World War I years. Here's the review on the parade grounds. Now, the normally quiet and staid community of New Rochelle at this time was grappling with the city's newly inflated population of pre-battle servicemen. We're talking 1917, when the population was about 25,000, and it was a fairly, quiet, up-and-coming American suburb. Quiet again. But things would all change the first week in December 1917. The headlines on the New York papers screamed, "New Rochelle is a hellhole of vice." This is because there was a great deal of German anti-German sentiment, and there were federal raids on the city's saloons, including one owned by Jacob Grab of German descent, and it was called Germania Hall. The federal agent claimed that they were corrupting the Fort Slocum Slocum servicemen with illegal liquor and scantily clad females, all within a few doors from City Hall, which was located just across the street. Germania Hall was on what's Memorial Highway now, about where Alvin and Friends is, and City Hall at the time was located on Main Street, right at the intersection of what's today Memorial Highway. The resorts, which the federal authorities say have been kept open day and night in defiance of the laws to traffic with young soldiers and sailors, are scattered throughout the business section, while a score or more are temptingly accessible to the young men who have enlisted for service against Germany. Well, this caused quite a scandal that would quickly be put aside because a few days later, on December 10th, 800 men trying to beat the December 20th cutoff for voluntary enlistment had arrived at New Rochelle's train station, seen on the left, to take trolleys down to the dock to get on the ferry, pictured on the right, over to Fort Slocum. By dusk, the ferry had stopped running. Fort Slocum could no longer hold any more, and it was filled beyond capacity. And from that day forward, thousands would arrive with each train. Fort Slocum shut down. Meanwhile, the young recruits kept coming and kept coming. There was a blizzard, there was some flu epidemic, and these young men were stranded. But the city mobilized. They would organize all of the recruits at the station, march them to the Knights of Columbus Hall, which was at 38 Center Avenue. It would later become Terry Tunes, and it's now a fruit and vegetable store. This building has had an amazing history. And here's where the recruits would be taken, and then they would be sent to different places throughout the community. Let's just keep going here. It'll go. Such as Anshe Sholem Synagogue, Temple Israel Synagogue downtown, St. Catherine's Church, fire stations such as Station 3, pictured here, fire headquarters, which was still on Church Street, and the Masonic Lodge, which still stands amazingly on Main Street and LeCount Place. And they were also housed at Germania Hall, where Jacob Grab, who had been accused of tainting them and serving them illegal liquor, he gave them beds and clothing and food. Here they were housed at Salem Baptist Church and the St. John's Methodist Episcopal Church that stood where the mall went in, which is now where New Rock City is. It was amazing. Everybody in New Rochelle was said to have contributed. And it was basically under the organizational skills of Mrs. Bedros Kazanjan. She was considered the mother of us all. She had organized the women for Red Cross duty, and she just took over. She and the other women rolled up their sleeves and they cooked all night long. They got bedding, they got all kinds of niceties, as they called them, to take care of these young men. And by the end of the week, they had safely housed, clothed, fed, entertained nearly 10,000 stranded young recruits. The young recruits, by the way, were so grateful that they took up collections. Here are the recruits at the Union Elementary School that used to be on Huguenot Street, and they were also at Trinity School. One said, "I never knew that such people lived. I never heard of anything like the way people in New Rochelle worked their heads off, spent their money, dug up their great supplies of food, and thrown their beautiful homes for a bunch of boys they never saw before. They made us feel so doggone welcome." And with all the nickels and dimes they all donated, they had a very special plaque created by one of the New Rochelle Art Association artists, and it still is in the rotunda of City Hall today. Another one to the Trinity School people by those recruits is up in the Carew boardroom of the Board of Education. These young recruits, and here's a picture of 2,500. So if you times that almost by 4, that's how many were housed or taken care of during that fateful recruit week. They all signed a letter. There was an act of Congress, and New Rochelle was again a shining star rather than a headline grabber for bad reasons. So once, before World War I ended, there would be another time that New Rochelle had an enormous impact on Fort Slocum and its life when the influenza took place, the Spanish influenza as it was called, as you know, had a tremendous impact. It killed more soldiers in World War I than battles. And at Fort Slocum, they just could not handle the number of troops that were stationed there, and the recruits and the women of New Rochelle. Every single nurse, anyone who had any nursing skills, rode over and took care of the young men in the same kind of organized style as they had used during recruit week. After World War I, the recruiting depot moved to Fort Hamilton. That same year, the renowned 18th Infantry Regiment was assigned to Fort Slocum, where it was based for the next 10 years. And during that time, the 18th dazzled New Rochellians with their band concerts on the island and off. Now you have to realize the ferries not only ferried service personnel, but were also ferrying over New Rochellians who worked on the island. And as I'll talk about a little later, many people today remember being ferried over to experience firsthand the life. It was not a sequestered island. People were allowed on certain days, and of course, those who worked. And the service personnel spent a lot of time in New Rochelle, shopping, going to the multitude of saloons. We always wondered why there were so many bars in New Rochelle in former years, and that was why. And they also participated in all kinds of events in New Rochelle. At any dedication of a monument, any parade, and New Rochelle had loads of parades. The band from Fort Slocum and the officers would all be participating. And if New Rochellians went over, they were invited for specific days where the skills of the soldiers as well as the band would be on display on the parade grounds. Here are members from Fort Slocum. You notice people from the Navy, but others behind them from Fort Slocum coming up North Avenue in the 250th anniversary parade. That was in 1938. They had a large contingent from the island. This parade, by the way, went on for 4 hours. It was just not to be believed. And we have loads of pictures of this particular event. New Rochelle was always one for pageantry and celebrations. And by this 1938, New Rochelle had become the 3rd wealthiest city per capita in New York, and the 3rd wealthiest, the 1st wealthiest in New York and the 3rd wealthiest in the country. Here we have the K building in the background. This is from the Mechanic Street by the train station. Mechanic is now Division. The K building being the tallest skyscraper for many years, including in 1938. And within earshot in the 30s of Fort Slocum, the big band sound was reverberating from the Glen Island Casino. People would flock from all over to listen to the big band sounds of first Oswald Nelson and his girl singer Harriet Hillard, later the Dorsey brothers, and the final act in the 30s being Glenn Miller. It was said that they would, anybody who booked a gig at Glen Island Casino had made it big. The radio shows were broadcast across the country, and of course, the soldiers could hear it all from their place on Fort Slocum. And we have oral histories talking about how many of them just thought they had the best bass in the world. They had beautiful panoramic views of the sound. They had the big band sound, and they could take a train to New York City to see shows, to go to the stores. It was quite a wonderful place if you were in the Army. And on the island itself, the New Rochelle girls and others from the area would go over for dances at the YMCA and mixers. There was always good times to be had at the YMCA during these times. And in the 1930s, Roosevelt Civilian Conservation Corps was stationed, or a group of them were stationed on the island, and they were responsible for doing extensive construction as the island continued to expand. These boys came from poor areas of, these particular boys were from the poor areas of Appalachia and other places in the South. It was an integrated group, but interestingly, none of the pictures show any of the African-American members. I just had a researcher contact me about this. She's doing a study on it, and I'm very anxious to have a copy of that when she finishes. So here's an aerial view of the base when we're nearing World War II years. You see the beautiful parade ground, and by this time, the iconic water tower has gone up. You see the athletic field here, the barracks, and gradually the barracks here and all around the parade grounds. And here's another aerial view. This one shows the artillery, these deep pits that if you were flying a drone over or even an aircraft, you might think these were UFO landing pads because there were big circles in it. Here's the parade field just to orient you. These barracks would later be replaced with ones in the 40s and the 50s. And here is the dock where the ferries would come in. And of course, you can see the parade ground. And you can see it's about 0.6 of a mile. The island itself, if you consider the underground, underwater part of it, is 90 acres. Usable, it's about 75 in low tide. And here, just to show you a picture that I'd shown before of the artillery, these are what were in those big things that I said would be like UFO landing. So these artillery could be rotated around to wherever that enemy ship would be seen. I don't think they were ever used, but you see how massive they are. And today on the island, they're all underground. They're tunnels from one to the other that, of course, are locked up. But the foundation is one of the few things left. So as I said, the Civilian Conservation Corps continued to do the construction. This was all part of the Works Progress Administration to help the country out of the Depression. And then a Corps Cooks and Bakers School was established. And we have these wonderful pictures of how they were learning to do everything. They actually had livestock on the island. As I said before, it was a self-contained community like Governor's Island, but much smaller. So they grew their own vegetables, they grew their own livestock. Everything was there, and whatever they needed, they could come by ferry to get in New Rochelle. And here they're getting their fresh vegetables to bring to the general mess. And a 9-hole golf course was built as well. By this time, Fort Slocum was ready for the next stage of his venerable career. From 1939 to 1945, the Transportation Corps had its Atlantic Coast Officer Training School here, and the fort was also a port of embarkation and an overseas staging area. You can see they're all getting ready to either come in or leave. I think they're getting ready to come in. And here's an Army transport that would not come into New Rochelle, but they would take smaller ships down to the Brooklyn Naval Yard to board these ships to be sent overseas. American enlisted and commissioned officers, as well as Allied troops, enjoyed rest and recreation, or R&R, on Fort Slocum base. And this is the time that the casual news kept up on everything going on at the fort. There was it was sort of like a school newspaper, and we have copies of all of the casual news, or just about all of them, that were published during this time. One of them has the Tilly the Toiler comic strip in it, and I had to include that because Russ Westover grew up in New Rochelle. He attended Iona Prep, and he was the creator of Tilly the Toiler, and his Hearst Syndicate comic strip went across the country, and there's a whole section that he gained his inspiration from the wax at Fort Slocum, and this particular strip that was shown in Casual News is all about Fort Slocum and features Colonel Lentz, who at that time was the colonel. Nightly recreation and entertainment was provided for the thousands of men now housed on the island. And you saw the pictures of some of the dances. This one, look closely. This apparently was an icebreaker where they had the men dancing with men and the women with women, which is a sort of a very interesting image from the Army photographic collection. Here you see one of the wax, and here's her, you know she's with the Transportation Corps. They all wore this emblem, and the wax were first allowed into the Transportation Corps. And here you see they're doing a satire. This is just one of this is the gymnasium that was not only used for recreational purposes, but also training. And here you see the Slocum band performing as they're doing the drills. Interestingly, it was at Fort Slocum that Willie Duckworth, one of these soldiers, wrote the hit tune for Sound Off. Here we have the wax that started coming in 1949. The first Slocum WAC was named Lieutenant Mary Flack. And the Casual News started running a column each week, WAC of the Week. Here you see them standing at attention, and I can see the T emblem on each of their shoulders. Of course, they had a teams for sports, just like the men. And if you can't read the sign, it is the beauty shop, was also an addition that came along with the wax. And which would lead to marriages as well. This is one marriage that took place in the St. Sebastian Chapel. Interestingly, the 16th Italian Quartermaster Unit, formerly POWs and units of repatriated American POWs, were also housed on the island. And I have accounts and oral histories of mothers in the West End being thrilled with this, this incoming group of young men from Italy who were allowed on and off the island. Even though they were considered prisoners of war, they were repatriated, and they could go to the West End for dinners. And we also have a number of these repatriated Italians who ended up staying in New Rochelle, marrying New Rochelle girls, and making this their home for good. I just wanted to go back again because I thought I had the picture and I wanted to show of Willie Duckworth, but I don't see it here. It's a really interesting story, and I didn't have a good picture of him, but I had one of a monument. Willie Duckworth was an African-American soldier, and we do have pictures of units that look like they were segregated up until post-World War II. He came from Georgia. He was the son of a sharecropper, and while he was doing some drills, he started singing this song, Sound Off. And they realized that soldiers would perform better with this music, and they institutionalized it. And it was all from this one soldier, and he created this song, Sound Off, which I won't sing for you, don't worry, when he was stationed here at Fort Slocum. And I wish I'd had that picture. For some reason, it didn't make it in. So here we are back to the Italians, and now we're back to another aerial view. And this is now, we're coming into the post-World War II era, and that would be the time when the island would be first used in 1946 as the Army Air Corps and then the administrative headquarters for the first U.S. Air Force. Now, this is not an airfield. This is, as I told you before, the parade field. And there were there was never an airstrip on the island, though it was the headquarters for the Air Force. The only plane that landed on the island was a single-engine reconnaissance aircraft that successfully alit on the 9-hole golf course. Interestingly, in 1949, returning pilots who had completed tours of duty in connection with the Berlin airlift were stationed here. The fort closed for a year beginning in October 1949. When it was recommissioned in December 1950, the Chaplain School would move in. And they had quarters here, there, and clearly I think it was the St. Sebastian Chapel, but they had another structure and they would switch it up for each of the religions. So everything was on wheels. So they had a crucifix on wheels for the Catholic services that would get wheeled out, and then an ark would be wheeled in for the Jewish services. And I have to tell you that the first Jewish services at any Army base in the United States happened at Fort Slocum, and that was during World War I. And they continued, the chaplains would be well-versed in all services, and they would all be conducted in this one shared space. Then it became the home of the Armed Forces Information School. This was in 1954. That would be renamed the Army Information School rather than the Armed Forces. It became concentrated into just the Army. By 1954, 20,000 men had graduated from that school. Here you see the U.S. Army Information Headquarters. In this shot, we are seeing pictures of cadets from West Point touring the school. Important graduation speakers and guests at the Army Information School included General Dwight Eisenhower, Cardinal Spellman, Eleanor Roosevelt, Arthur Hayes Sulzberger spoke a number of times, and another frequent visitor was Tom Hochter, my predecessor, city historian of New Rochelle. He was also the PR man for Pan Am, and he, I think, would be brought over to talk about public relations to these chaps. You can see he is just thrilled to be there. He looks so handsome there. From 1955 to 1961, a Nike Unit D missile battery of the 66th Artillery was stationed on the island, with the missile launchers just south on Hart's Island, which, by the way, had a very similar parallel as David's Island. This picture is from Armed Forces Day in 1955, which was attended by over 2,500 people. Now you have to keep in mind that here's the ferry that is leaving the Fort Slocum dock on New Rochelle to go over to the island. 3 ferries operated between the island in 30-minute intervals. And these ferries transported the island's inhabitants, servicemen, spouses, and children who attended Jefferson and Webster schools, as well as Isaac Young Junior High School at that time, and the high school. They would also ferry people over who worked there. There was quite a connection between New Rochelle and the island. This is a snapshot that one of the children of an officer loaned me when he came for a visit. You can see a lot of the teens just hanging out. We also have a picture of all the kids playing on the Rodman gun. And interestingly, in the artifacts that came off the island, there's a bunch of toy soldiers and other things. Oh, and these men, when they came to visit, had such stories to tell, wonderful stories about growing up on the island, how they were determined to get into the jail and got caught and were put in the jail for a few hours to scare them so it wouldn't happen again. They were all filled with shenanigans. And this is a picture that somebody gave me whose father ran the laundry. This was Barbara Harris's dad. And you can see one soldier's fascinated with his stories. So there was quite a number of people working on this beautifully manicured piece of property. The gardens were gorgeous, everything about it, all the buildings just pristine. Everything was so well maintained. And here's the YMCA and trees in full bloom. But by March 1963, the Army Chaplain School moved to Fort Hamilton. Then the Army announced that the Information School would be moved to Fort Benjamin Harrison. By January 1st, 1966, Fort Slocum was deactivated as an Army base and abandoned. The next thing that would happen on the island was probably the most unusual. And it fascinates me that so few people who were in Rochelle at that time remember it. But the story is that there was a Dutch ship that had come from Africa, headed for zoos in America, but it had stopped at a few ports where there was an evidence of hoof and mouth disease. And when that was discovered, the word was sent to the ship that it would not be allowed to dock in US waters. The captain threatened to just push all the exotic animals overboard. And when Americans got wind of that, they went after their congresspeople and legislators and convinced them to do something. What they did was to bring the ship into the Brooklyn Navy Yard and barge all of these animals, 55 of them, to Fort Slocum. So for 90 days, these wild animals, including a giraffe, a water buffalo, and all kinds of weird animals I can't even find in the dictionary, roamed the island until they were cleared. There were antelopes, gazelles, and apparently the only thing that worried the New Rochellians on shore were that the water buffalo might be able to swim across. But they were reassured that it was not a dangerous animal. So on May 11th, 1967, exactly 100 years after the government had purchased David's Island from Simeon Leland, the city of New Rochelle finalized the purchase of the property, paying about $500,000. And include all the property, including a little bit of mainland property where the fort is and where what is now Neptune Park, or has been Neptune Park, but the parking lot that is adjacent to Neptune Park. All kinds of ideas were floated: a corporate park, a convalescent hospital, a gambling casino, university, a resort, a national park, a Disneyland or world or whatever. And it needed to be quickly, but none of it came to fruition. In the meantime, it was being used for Boy Scout camporees, like this one in the 70s. The Up With People folks, those very cheerful youngsters from all over, were using the quarters there for a couple of summer. And meanwhile, Con Edison entered with a proposal to the city of New Rochelle to put a 4 1 million kilowatt nuclear power plants, to put 4 1 million kilowatt nuclear power plants on the island. It would require no municipal services, no bridge, and it would give $260,000 in taxes each year. In 1968, the city sold the island to Con Ed for about $3 million. And that was the end of anything to do with the island, we thought. However, Con Ed, because of a tremendous outcry from the public against the nuclear power plants, Con Ed in 1973 abandoned its plans and tried to sell the islands back to New Rochelle. It finally gifted the island to the city for $1 in July of 1976. And then from then on, once it was abandoned, brush fires, Mother Nature, lack of maintenance, it just brought ruin to the island. when you don't maintain a building's roof, you're going to lose the building. People could canoe out, as they still do today. They could row out, not too many kayakers at that time, and kids would start fires, or lightning would start a fire, and there was no way to put the fire out. I remember this very fire in 1987 from Davenport Park. You could see the blaze. So the next thing that would happen would be a company by the name of Xanadu. Their proposal was for the construction of 1,750 luxury condominium units from low-rise to 19 stories, a marina for 800 boats, retail stores, and a heliport. A bridge was to connect the island to the mainland. 2 of its 14 piers would be on Glen Island, the county-owned park, and the community would have very limited public access. Well, this did not comply with the state's local waterfront revitalization programs guidelines. The city was very much behind it, and it was a very divisive time for this community because everybody saw the tax revenue, and this was a time of great economic downturn for the community. So it was a very, very divisive time for New Rochelle, with environmentalists coming out in full force, say no to David's Island. This one letter on the right is encouraging voters to be part of a protest. There were all kinds of public hearings. School district was very much in favor. And the thing that finally put a kibosh on the Xanadu proposal was the lack of public access. And it finally, with the state's Secretary of State, Gail Schaefer, rejecting the proposal, Xanadu withdrew its application. And in March 1992, City Council rejected their standing proposal. You can see there's Tim Idoni in the middle, Alex Yodice, Ruth Kitchen, Mr. Zaccanino, and Joe Facina. Then there would be other ideas. There was one for a monorail link. The College of New Rochelle's Castle Gallery had a design competition, and kids came up with amusement parks, and there were all kinds of ideas for the island. But the problem always was, if you didn't do a bridge, how are you going to get people out there? Well, next came Donald Trump, who wanted to build luxury condominiums. And the city gave him sole developer rights for a period of time, requiring a $500,000 deposit from Mr. Trump. They gave him a year to come up with a plan. And then in 1996, the deadline was extended to June. He proposed 43 substantial mansions on the former Army base. The city agreed to sell him the whole kit and caboodle for 1 penny less than $13 million. By the spring of 1996, following a harsh winter, Trump got cold feet, and citing a 5-acre discrepancy in the island's ownership, apparently Con Ed retained a bit of land on the island, and it was considered a low-level hazardous waste site, ranking recently by the disclosed U.S. Army. Trump changed his course and pulled out. Here you see him talking to city council, showing that the inside of the island was going to be a park. So what happened next? The island sat and again abandoned, no maintenance, no accessibility. It was closed to the public, of course. So all of the buildings started deteriorating. And as I said before, once the roof goes, the rest of the buildings are going to go. When it closed in 1965, it contained more than 80 buildings, primarily of brick, but also of concrete, clay, and wood. There were more than a score of other structures and facilities, including the artillery earthwork I showed you, paved roads, paths, seawalls, and piers, and the steel water tower. And the pictures you're going to see now are ones that I took in the 80s and the 90s, and then again, right before the cleanup was completed. What happened in 2004 was that the federal government provided funds to either restore the ruins or demolish all of them. And over a course of a number of years, there was this long back and forth meetings and meetings and meetings trying to figure out what could be salvaged of the island, what could be preserved, but anything that could be preserved had to be maintained. And it caused quite a challenge for interested parties, as we were called, to figure out what to do. But you'll see in these pictures the kind of destruction that happened over between 1968 and I would say the first time I went on the island was early 1990s. Some of the wood structures amazingly survived fires, and this was one of the officers' houses that actually still had its roof and its windows, but some of the other brick buildings, not so much. Here are some officer headquarters looking out towards the mainland. Another structure that's just down to some bare walls. Here's the Rodman cannon that is still on the island. It's several tons. This structure is a holding area for bodies. It was first built during the smallpox epidemic. And there's also a crematorium, or was a crematorium. Again, it was self-contained. So all the needs were met. There was a jail, as I mentioned. And this building was pretty much intact. It almost would appear to be a root cellar. Here you see one of the buildings from 1888. And they retained their brick walls, but without the roof, of course, nothing else. But the brick was phenomenal and in very good shape. This is the building when it was first built, and here you see it today. One of the things that happened when the Army Corps of Engineers came in, and this was federal funds that had been obtained by Congresswoman Nita Lowey, a mitigation process kicked in. Because when Xanadu was putting together its proposal, there had to be an environmental impact statement. And those impact statements include the question, is there archaeological significance? So phase 1 studies had to be done, and lo and behold, significant archaeological evidence was found, including remains from the Siwanoy Indians and prehistoric remains. So it was listed on the State Historic Preservation Office eligibility for National Register list. Because it was eligible, it didn't even have to be on the National Register. Because it was eligible and federal funds were being used, a process kicked in. Because when something's eligible and state or federal funds are used, they need to be sure that this is a property that can be raised. So that's what happened with these years of looking at every structure. This fort was probably the most well-documented fort. We had the benefit of Michael Cavanaugh, who spent time on the fort as a child and has become sort of the archivist for the island and has amassed all kinds of information. We had all the photographs from the Army's Information School that had been given to me by a member of Save David's Island, and where he got them, I'm not sure, but they ended up with us and they are in the public domain and now part of our collection. So we had all of these records to document these buildings. However, there was no plan for saving the island, and City Council would have had to say, this is how we are going to protect and preserve the buildings if you're going to leave them. What we were able to do was, I was able to convince them to mark where every single building was with the bricks that came from the demolition. The bricks were also chunked up, made into scrap and left on the island. If it was hazardous waste, it was barged off. And there was an amazing website created. However, there were issues with, and that's still on my to-do list, is to get that website back in the public domain, because it was really very good, that told the history. So it was sort of a virtual museum of David's Island. And I'm telling you all this, showing you these two pictures, because you can well imagine, as a historic preservationist, the way my heart broke when I walked around this island in a Tyvek suit, because there's poison ivy from one end to the other. It is just invasives throughout the island. The last time it was a viable ecosystem was when the Huguenots, before the Huguenots used it for cattle grazing. So it's mostly invasives. All those beautiful trees you saw on the parade ground, most of them are gone, but we're all documented. All those documents are part of the David's Island Fort Slocum collection at the New Rochelle Public Library, and it is extensive, and we're constantly digitizing it and making it accessible. This is one of the saddest pictures. This is St. Sebastian Chapel, the one that was built by Peter Dorn of Blessed Sacrament and funded by probably the congregants. The stained glass windows were gifted back to Blessed Sacrament, and the transom was saved. And I think it's in a safe hiding place, as well as just a few other things I was able to have them salvage and save. One of the visits out, when we had alum come out on the island to visit before the demolition occurred, this woman's parents were married in the chapel. Harold Crocker, some of you know, who was the football coach at the New Rochelle High School for many years, he also was with our group, his parents, Rose Crocker, and had been married in this chapel. And members of the information schools, such as this gentleman, came from all parts of the country to visit the island one more time. And this had been where he was living in barracks, now being taken down. And you can see the stone is being crushed and pulverized to be left on the island. And the iconic water tower, this was really sad too, because this had been a nautical tool for boaters for so many years. And we all looked out on the island and saw it. You could see it from all the beach clubs. And I know Mary Jane Reddington is listening. She tells a story about her kids would be at Davenport Club, and she'd hear the bugles playing at the fort, and she knew it was time to bundle them up and take them home as they looked out at this island with these beautiful buildings and this water tower. Well, the city could not validate keeping it. It was considered a liability. So they had everybody out, interested parties to come out. They tied a chain to it and slowly pulled it down. And some of you remember there was an NAVY painted on the side of it. And when it came down, a bucket of paint came spilling out of it. The Navy guys who had gone up while they were competing in an Army-Navy game had left the paint up there many, many years ago. You can see Trump Tower here in the distance. And here's just the mess that was left. And when I say everything was removed from the island, everything, even the garbage receptacles that were made out of brick, even all those little outbuildings, everything was analyzed, everything was looked at, everything was documented, and then it was all taken down. This was one thing I was able to save, the eagle that was over the post headquarters, because it was pretty much intact. And interestingly, it was the older buildings, the ones that were built in the 1880s, because they didn't build them, they built them to last forever back then. And this one had many of its walls, and certainly its foundation. And here was the temporary loading dock that the workers used, and they were a fine group of people. They told us, I have a oral history that I did of one of them. He had just about pulled off when he sees a deer coming across, wanting to jump aboard the boat to get back to the island, back to the mainland. I don't know, it was the deer that they had to send back to the island. I saw no wildlife when I was out there. It really is just invasives from one end to the other, and not open to the public, though certainly people do go out there on their own. And I'll just leave you with two more aerial shots. Again, we showed this one earlier. Here's Davenport Neck, Glen Island, and you can see the line. This is the way the ferry would go back into the mainland. Here we have Big P Island and Little P Island. Little P Island got washed away. I mean, Big P Island got washed away in one of the storms. Little P Island now has a house on it, and the other house is on Goose Island. And that is the end of my program. You can now unmute yourself, and I will try to bring my self back up. And here we go. If you have questions, just unmute yourself and let me know. And I'll also look in the chat to see if there's any questions in the chat. For those that you don't know, the chat box is down here, and you can, oh, somebody did the, brought the Find a Grave for me, showing the cadence for sound off. There's also a YouTube that Michael Kavanaugh posted of some wax performing the sound off.
Who is it?
Alexander or something?
Are there any other questions?
Hi, Agnes. Yeah, I'm going to call you back. All right, I'm on Zoom. I'm watching a program.
Thank you, Barbara. It was terrific.
Okay, and thank you.
It was terrific.
Somebody's asking, is it legal for us to kayak there? No. And I'm going to tell you, it is hazardous. It is, if you are at all allergic to poison ivy, you do not want to go on that island. I just look at it. Everything is just the right height, and the poison ivy's on trees. It's all over the place. It also has some areas where the artillery was that you could sink into. It's just not a safe place. And if you get stuck out there, you're stuck. The Harbor Patrol does not think kindly of rescuing people from out there, though they would, of course. So unfortunately, no, it's not a good idea. But go kayak around it. Kayak around it. Are there any other? Yes.
I can't make myself seen, but I have two comments and one little question. In the late, I think early 60s, I did go to Fort Slocum and dance with the soldiers with my friend. And also I remember Up with People. I didn't remember it was at on the island. Maybe it was somewhere else. I wasn't sure.
Well, they slept on the island in the barracks, and then they performed in Rochelle.
Okay.
But and that's the fun thing. Several of my friends remember taking the ferry over and having to go through the sentry guard to be quizzed on who they were. And then bring their bike over, and they'd ride their bike with their friends that they went to school with. And, that was so cool that they, could have friends that lived on an army base. What people forget, I think, when the base closed in the 60s, there was a whole confluence of bad things that happened in New Rochelle. And that was one of them. It was a major economic hit to New Rochelle because they used to get their, supplies on the mainland. People work there. I think it had more of a financial ramifications, economic ramifications than have ever been sort of recognized.
Okay, I have a quick, what year was the, do you know, the Noah's Ark barge? I'm curious.
67, I think, or 68.
Oh, okay.
It was, no, it was, I'm sorry, 63. It's 1963.
Oh, okay. I was wondering where I was in my life and why I didn't know about it. Okay, now I understand, kind of.
Does anybody else have a question? No? Okay, our next one's going to be in 2 weeks, and that will be suffragists, and that is so in recognition of the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment. I thank you so much all for joining me today.